In the early hours of a quiet California morning in 1924, illness did not trigger panic the way it should have. There was no rush for a doctor, no frantic knock on a neighbor's door, no desperate search for medicine. Instead, there was calm, reverence, even gratitude. In one small, insular community, sickness was not feared, it was welcomed. A fever was not a warning. Pain was not a problem. Weakness was not a failure of the body. It was a sign that something sacred was unfolding. To the people inside this group, disease meant you had been noticed. They believed illness was not random, not biological, not the result of infection or neglect. It was an initiation, a test, a threshold between the ordinary world and something higher. The worse the suffering, the greater the spiritual significance. Recovery was not always celebrated. Sometimes, it was quietly questioned. And seeking medical help was seen not as self-preservation, but as betrayal. This was not a fringe superstition whispered on the edges of society. It existed in California during the 1920s, a place often remembered for optimism, innovation, and progress. But beneath the surface of sunshine and new beginnings, there was fear. Fear of modern medicine. Fear left behind by war and pandemic. Fear that science, for all its promises, could not answer the most terrifying question of all: why do some people suffer while others are spared? Into that fear stepped a belief system that offered certainty. It explained illness not as chaos, but as destiny. It gave meaning to pain. It turned helplessness into purpose. And once suffering is given meaning, it becomes very easy to justify. Within this group, children learned early that their bodies did not belong to them in the way other children's did. A cough was watched closely, not with concern, but with expectation. A rash might be interpreted as a sign of spiritual growth. Persistent weakness could elevate a family's standing within the community. The sick were not pitied. They were observed, studied, revered, and sometimes quietly abandoned to their fate. From the outside, nothing appeared immediately wrong. There were no dramatic rituals in the streets, no mass gatherings that drew attention, no open declarations of defiance against the law. The danger was quieter than that. It lived in whispered teachings, private prayers, and unspoken rules enforced through shame rather than violence. It lived in the decision not to call a doctor, in the choice to pray instead of intervene, in the belief that interference could interrupt a sacred process already underway. Most people never saw what happened behind closed doors. Illness unfolded slowly. Infections worsened. Fevers lingered. Conditions that were treatable, even by the limited medical standards of the 1920s, were allowed to progress unchecked. When someone died, it was not described as preventable. It was described as completion, a successful passage through suffering into something beyond this world. To question that interpretation was dangerous, because if illness was initiation, then doubting it meant rejecting the entire spiritual framework that gave people comfort. It meant admitting that suffering might be meaningless, that pain might not have a higher purpose. And for people who had already endured loss, poverty, war, or disease, that was a truth too frightening to accept. This is how the most dangerous ideas take root, not through force, but through reassurance. The cult did not begin with death. It began with explanation. It promised that nothing happened by accident, that the body was a messenger, that sickness was not something to be fought, but something to be listened to. And once that idea settled in, medicine became unnecessary. Doctors became obstacles. Science became a distraction from the true work being done within the soul. What makes this story especially unsettling is how ordinary it looked at first. The members were not obviously delusional. Many were educated. Some were well-read. Others were simply desperate. Parents terrified of losing children, adults haunted by chronic illness, families still reeling from the Spanish flu that had swept through just a few years earlier and killed millions worldwide. Conventional medicine had failed many of them. Hospitals were overcrowded. Treatments were inconsistent. Doctors did not always have answers. So when someone came along and said suffering meant something, that it was chosen, not random, that it elevated rather than destroyed, you can understand why people listened. But belief does not stop bacteria from spreading. Faith does not reverse organ failure. And prayer does not replace antibiotics that had already begun to exist, even if they were not yet widely trusted. Inside this community, however, Trust was not placed in the body's ability to heal through medical intervention. It was placed in endurance. The longer someone suffered, the more committed they appeared. To recover too quickly could raise suspicion. To seek outside help was often framed as spiritual weakness. Some members learned to hide their pain until it became impossible to ignore. Others learned to reinterpret their fear as doubt that needed to be suppressed. Children, especially, had no choice. They were taught that obedience extended to their own physical suffering, that crying out in pain showed lack of faith, that enduring illness quietly was a form of devotion. In this way, neglect was sanctified. And once neglect is holy, intervention becomes sinful. The true horror of this story is not just what happened, but how long it took for anyone to notice. Deaths were explained away. Declining health was reframed as progress. Outsiders who expressed concern were dismissed as spiritually blind. And because the group did not outwardly challenge the state or announce itself as radical, it remained largely invisible. This is not a story about madness in the obvious sense. It is about logic taken one step too far, about meaning layered onto suffering until pain itself becomes untouchable. It is about what happens when a belief system closes itself off from correction, when every outcome, even death, is interpreted as confirmation. By the time questions began to surface, the damage had already been done. Families had lost children. Children had grown up believing their pain was necessary. Survivors carried bodies permanently altered by untreated illness and minds shaped by guilt, wondering whether seeking help earlier would have been a betrayal, or whether obedience had truly been worth the cost. And yet, this case rarely appears in textbooks. It is not widely remembered. It exists in fragments, court records, newspaper clippings, testimonies whispered decades later. Perhaps because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most destructive cults are not always the loudest. Sometimes they operate quietly, teaching people not to rebel, but to endure. In 1924 California, illness was transformed into initiation. And once suffering became sacred, there was no longer any urgency to stop it. By the early 1920s, California occupied a strange and contradictory place in the American imagination. It was a land of sunshine and reinvention, a destination for those who believed they could escape the weight of the past and start again. Veterans returned from World War I hoping distance might quiet what the war had done to them. Families uprooted themselves from the Midwest and East Coast in search of health, prosperity, and spiritual renewal. Los Angeles and its surrounding communities swelled with newcomers, all carrying their own grief, fear, and unmet expectations. The state had already established itself as a hub for unconventional healing. Faith-based practices, dietary movements, metaphysical philosophies, and spiritualist groups flourished openly. Christian Science promoted the idea that illness was an illusion of the mind. New Thought emphasized mental discipline as a path to health. Sanitariums, fasting retreats, and natural healing colonies dotted the landscape. Many of these movements did not reject science outright, but they questioned its authority, positioning spirituality as a deeper, more reliable truth. For people who felt betrayed by doctors, this message was seductive. It told them their suffering was not evidence of failure, either their own or medicine's, but a sign they were participating in something larger. Illness, within these frameworks, could be reinterpreted as imbalance, moral misalignment, or spiritual trial. And unlike medicine, these belief systems always had an explanation. If someone did not recover, it was not because the system was flawed. It was because the lesson had not yet been fully learned. California also attracted charismatic figures who understood how to package certainty. These leaders spoke with confidence at a time when traditional authorities wavered. They blended biblical language with Eastern philosophy, moral discipline with promises of transcendence. They offered rules in an era of confusion. And most importantly, they offered meaning. In a world where suffering had recently seemed random and catastrophic, meaning was priceless. Social isolation amplified this effect. Many newcomers had no extended family nearby. They lacked long-standing community ties. Churches, spiritual groups, and alternative health collectives filled that void. Belonging became intertwined with belief. To question the teachings of the group meant risking not just faith, but community, support, and identity. Meanwhile, the legal system offered little protection. Religious freedom was fiercely defended, especially after the war. Authorities were hesitant to interfere in spiritual practices unless clear criminal activity could be proven. Child welfare laws were inconsistent and weakly enforced. Medical neglect, especially when justified by religious belief, occupied a grey area few officials wanted to enter. As long as no one complained loudly enough, groups were often left alone. This created an environment where dangerous ideas could quietly harden into doctrine. Within this landscape, the notion that illness itself could be spiritually valuable did not seem absurd. It felt logical to those already primed by loss and disappointment. If medicine could not save loved ones during the flu, why trust it now? If suffering was unavoidable, why not believe it served a purpose? And if the body failed despite prayer, perhaps that failure was not defeat, but fulfillment. The cultural obsession with self-improvement also played a role. The 1920s celebrated discipline, purity, and control. Physical weakness was often moralized. Eugenics rhetoric circulated openly, suggesting that bodies reflected inner worth. Though the cult's beliefs did not always align explicitly with eugenics, they existed in the same atmosphere, one where biology, morality, and destiny were dangerously intertwined. Illness, in this context, became a test of character. Those who endured quietly were praised. Those who sought help were subtly shamed. Dependency on doctors could be reframed as weakness, while endurance became virtue. Over time, this logic made medical neglect feel not just acceptable, but admirable. The contrast between California's public image and its private realities is what makes this period so unsettling. While Hollywood sold dreams of glamour and escape, many communities were quietly unraveling. Poverty, untreated mental illness, and physical disease persisted behind closed doors. Spiritual movements promised order where none seemed to exist. They offered a narrative that turned chaos into design. And once suffering was woven into that design, it became resistant to challenge. People inside these groups did not see themselves as cruel or negligent. They believed they were protecting something sacred. Interfering with illness, from their perspective, risked interrupting a divine process. The idea that intervention could cause harm, not prevent it, became deeply ingrained. By the time the cult that treated illness as initiation began to take shape, California was already primed to accept it. The soil had been prepared by grief, uncertainty, and disillusionment. The beliefs did not emerge in a vacuum. They grew out of a decade that had shaken faith in institutions and left many searching for answers that science could not yet provide. What followed was not an aberration of history, but a warning. A reminder that when fear outpaces knowledge, and meaning is offered without accountability, even suffering can be transformed into something people are taught to protect rather than prevent. The individual who would become the architect of this belief system did not begin as a villain, nor even as a radical. By most outward measures, they appeared ordinary, intelligent, articulate, and deeply convinced that they had discovered a truth others were too fearful to face. Their authority did not come from official credentials or institutional power, but from something far more persuasive in the early 20th century, personal revelation shaped by suffering. Years before the group coalesced into anything recognizable as a cult, this figure lived a life marked by illness and disappointment. Accounts suggest prolonged periods of physical weakness, recurring pain, or chronic symptoms that resisted treatment. Doctors offered explanations, but few solutions. Treatments were uncomfortable, expensive, and often inconclusive. Each failed attempt reinforced a growing conviction that conventional medicine was not just ineffective, but fundamentally misguided. What began as frustration slowly hardened into ideology. Rather than accept the randomness of disease, they searched for patterns. Illness, they concluded, did not strike without reason. It arrived at moments of spiritual significance. It revealed inner truths. And if medicine could not cure it, perhaps that was because curing it was never the point. This idea did not emerge fully formed. It evolved through reading, correspondence, and exposure to the spiritual movements thriving in California at the time. The founder absorbed fragments from Christian Science, Eastern mysticism, and moralistic interpretations of bodily discipline. But instead of adopting any one system wholesale, they blended elements together into something uniquely rigid. Where other movements emphasized healing, this belief emphasized endurance. Where others promised recovery, this one promised elevation through suffering. Personal charisma did the rest. Those who encountered the founder described someone who spoke calmly about pain, who framed illness with certainty rather than fear. In a culture still traumatized by mass death and medical helplessness, this confidence was magnetic. People did not feel judged in their suffering, they felt chosen. The founder listened carefully to stories of sickness, grief, and loss, then reinterpreted them through a spiritual lens that transformed misfortune into validation. If you were ill, it was not because you were unlucky. It was because you were ready. Early followers were often people already isolated by their conditions. Chronic illness separated them from work, social life, and community. The founder offered not just explanation, but belonging. Meetings were intimate, quiet, almost therapeutic in tone. There were no dramatic sermons at first, only discussions framed as shared understanding. Over time, however, interpretation became instruction, and instruction became doctrine. Central to the founder's authority was the claim that they had endured suffering and emerged enlightened. Their own illness was presented as proof of insight. Recovery, if it occurred, was framed not as medical success but as spiritual completion. If symptoms persisted, that too was meaningful. Every outcome reinforced the narrative. Contradiction was impossible. As the group grew, the founder began documenting their ideas, through handwritten notes, letters to followers, and spoken teachings repeated until they became accepted truth. Illness was described as a language spoken by the body, one that only the spiritually attentive could understand. Doctors, by contrast, were portrayed as interpreters who silenced that language rather than listening to it. Medicine, in this framework, did not merely fail, it interfered. The founder was careful not to attack science outright in the beginning. Instead, they positioned it as incomplete, useful for minor matters, perhaps, but blind to deeper processes. This subtlety allowed followers to transition gradually from skepticism to rejection without feeling abrupt or extreme. By the time medical avoidance became explicit, it felt like a natural progression rather than a radical shift. Control emerged quietly. Followers were encouraged to share details of their health openly within the group. Symptoms were discussed, interpreted, and assigned meaning. Over time, this created a hierarchy of suffering. Those who endured more were admired more. Those whose conditions worsened were spoken of with reverence. And those who improved too quickly were gently questioned. Had they truly surrendered to the process, or were they resisting it? The founder never needed to issue direct commands. The belief system policed itself. Any doubt could be reframed as fear. Any desire for relief could be labeled impatience. Seeking a doctor was not punished overtly. It was mourned as a spiritual setback. Members internalized these judgments, often silencing their own instincts before anyone else needed to intervene. Children born into the group were especially vulnerable. The founder spoke often about purity, destiny, and the special sensitivity of young bodies. Childhood illness was portrayed as particularly meaningful, a sign of early spiritual attunement. Parents were encouraged to observe rather than interfere, to trust the process unfolding within their children. To act too quickly, they were told, risked interrupting something sacred. What made the founder particularly dangerous was not cruelty, but conviction. There is little evidence of overt sadism or malicious intent. Instead, there was certainty, absolute and unwavering. Suffering was not an unfortunate side effect of belief, it was the belief. And because the founder truly believed it, followers did too. When people died, grief was real, but it was reframed as reverence. Loss became proof. Doubt became weakness. As the group expanded, the founder withdrew further from outside influence. Critics were dismissed as spiritually blind. Concerned relatives were portrayed as threats to progress. The world beyond the group was described as noisy, fearful, and obsessed with avoiding pain at all costs. Inside, suffering was quiet, purposeful, and dignified. This isolation strengthened the founder's position. Without competing narratives, their interpretation became the only one available. And once illness was fully integrated into identity and status, questioning it meant questioning one's own worth. By the early 1920s, the doctrine was firmly established. Illness was initiation. Endurance was devotion. Intervention was betrayal. What had begun as one person's attempt to make sense of their own suffering had metastasized into a system that required others to suffer in order to remain coherent. The founder did not need to enforce obedience through fear. The belief did that work on its own. And that is what made it endure, quietly, invisibly, until the consequences could no longer be contained. The figure at the center of this movement was not someone history would normally single out as dangerous. There were no records of criminal behavior in their early life, no signs of violence, no obvious hunger for power. What set them apart was something far more subtle and far more common, an unshakable belief that their suffering had revealed a hidden truth about the world. Long before others began gathering around them, this person lived with persistent illness. Accounts differ on the exact nature of it. Some describe recurring fevers and exhaustion, others speak of debilitating pain that came and went without clear explanation. What is consistent, however, is that medical intervention brought little relief. Doctors offered diagnoses that shifted over time, treatments that promised improvement but rarely delivered it. Each appointment ended the same way: uncertainty, expense, and the quiet implication that nothing more could be done. For many, this would have been the end of the story. But for this individual, it became the beginning of something else. They began to write extensively during these periods of illness. Journals from later investigations suggest long passages reflecting on pain not as an enemy, but as a signal. A message. The body, they believed, was not malfunctioning, it was communicating. And what it was communicating could not be understood through instruments or examinations, but through submission and reflection. The idea took hold slowly, then completely. They immersed themselves in the spiritual literature circulating through California at the time. Christian Science texts emphasizing the illusory nature of disease. New Thought writings suggesting that belief shaped reality. Translations of Eastern philosophy that framed suffering as a necessary stage in transformation. None of these alone were extreme. Together, filtered through the lens of personal illness, they became something rigid and unforgiving. Illness, in this emerging worldview, was not a condition to escape. It was a calling to accept. When the individual began sharing these ideas with others, they did so carefully. There were no proclamations, no demands, only conversations. They spoke with people who were already ill, already disillusioned with medicine, already tired of being told that improvement might come eventually. To them, the message was a relief. It suggested that they had not failed to heal. Healing, according to this belief, had never been the goal. What mattered was endurance. As small gatherings formed, the individual positioned themselves not as a leader, but as an interpreter, someone who had been through it and come back with understanding. They spoke calmly about pain, never dismissing it, never dramatizing it. Instead, they reframed it. Pain was not random. Pain was specific. It arrived when the soul was ready for deeper work. This reframing was powerful. It gave people agency without offering solutions. You could not control illness, but you could control how faithfully you endured it. In a time when bodies felt fragile and unpredictable, this was comforting. Suffering became something you could succeed at. Gradually, the individual's interpretations hardened into principles. They began to suggest that medical intervention interfered with the body's spiritual process. Not aggressively at first, just a warning. Medicine, they said, might suppress symptoms without addressing their meaning. Relief, therefore, could be misleading. Recovery could even be a setback if it prevented the completion of an inner transformation. This was the turning point. Once illness was framed as spiritually productive, healing became suspicious. People who improved too quickly were asked gentle questions. Had they truly surrendered? Had fear driven them to seek help prematurely? These questions were never accusations, but they carried weight. No one wanted to appear afraid. No one wanted to admit doubt. The individual's own health played a crucial role in maintaining authority. Whenever their symptoms worsened, it was presented as evidence of deep spiritual labor. When they improved, it was framed as a natural conclusion of that labor. Either outcome reinforced their position. There was no scenario in which the belief could be disproven. Over time, the group began to rely on this person not just for interpretation of illness, but for interpretation of life events more broadly. Loss, hardship, even death were explained through the same lens. Nothing was accidental. Everything was purposeful. And purpose was always tied to endurance. Children born into the community were taught these ideas before they could question them. Illness was discussed openly, almost clinically, but stripped of fear. A fever was not alarming, it was observed. A cough was not treated, it was monitored for meaning. Parents were encouraged to remain calm, to trust the process, to resist what the founder described as impulsive interference. To intervene too soon, they were told, was to interrupt something sacred. The individual rarely had to enforce compliance directly. Social reinforcement did the work. Families who followed the teachings faithfully were praised for their discipline. Those who hesitated were met with quiet concern. The possibility that seeking a doctor might signal spiritual failure became deeply internalized. Isolation strengthened this dynamic. As members withdrew from outside influences, the founders' interpretations became the only framework available. Alternative explanations, biological, medical, or otherwise, were dismissed as shallow or incomplete. The world beyond the group was portrayed as fearful and obsessed with comfort. Inside, suffering was dignified. What is most unsettling is how sincere it all was. There is no evidence that this person sought wealth or fame. There were no lavish displays of power. Control was exercised through belief, not coercion. And because the founder genuinely believed in the doctrine, followers trusted it even more. Conviction, after all, is contagious. When illness worsened, when children failed to recover, when lives were cut short, the response was never outrage. It was reflection. What lesson had been completed? What stage had been reached? Grief existed, but it was carefully managed, wrapped in language that transformed loss into fulfillment. By the early 1920s, the individual had become indispensable to the group's identity. Their interpretations shape how members understood their bodies, their families, and their fate. To question them was not just to question authority, it was to question the meaning of one's own suffering. And once suffering becomes meaningful, it becomes very difficult to let go of it. What began as one person's attempt to make sense of chronic illness had evolved into a closed system, one that required ongoing pain to validate its truth. Without suffering, the belief collapsed. And so suffering, quietly and reverently, was allowed to continue. At the heart of the group's ideology was a single, unsettling inversion of reality. Illness was no longer a threat to life, but a measure of spiritual progress. Where most people saw disease as something to be fought, avoided, or cured, this belief system redefined it as a sign that the individual had entered a deeper stage of awakening. Health was ordinary. Sickness was exceptional. This doctrine did not emerge as a single proclamation. It was built gradually, layer by layer, until it became the only framework through which members understood their bodies. The body, they were taught, was not a biological machine governed by chance or germs. It was a spiritual instrument. When it malfunctioned, it was not breaking down, it was being tuned. Illness, according to this logic, arrived only when the individual was ready. Ready to confront inner resistance. Ready to release attachment to comfort. Ready to prove faith through endurance. Minor ailments were interpreted as early signals, gentle invitations to pay attention. Persistent or painful conditions marked a more advanced stage. Severe, life-threatening illness was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, as though it placed the sufferer on the threshold of something profound. Recovery, in contrast, was morally ambiguous. If someone improved quickly, it raised questions. Had the lesson truly been learned? Had fear interrupted the process? Relief, in this framework, was not inherently good. It could be premature. It could indicate avoidance. The idea that one might seek comfort instead of meaning became a quiet source of shame. The group's teachings divided illness into stages, though rarely in explicit terms. Members simply absorbed the hierarchy over time. A headache or fatigue suggested early sensitivity. Chronic conditions implied deeper spiritual work. And those whose bodies deteriorated visibly were often regarded with a mixture of admiration and solemn respect. Their suffering elevated not only themselves, but the community that witnessed it. This hierarchy created a dangerous incentive. The worse your condition, the more spiritually significant you became. Language played a crucial role in sustaining this belief. Words like infection, disease, or failure were discouraged. Instead, symptoms were described as processes, transitions, or openings. Pain was not pain, it was pressure. Weakness was not decline, it was surrender. Death, when it occurred, was rarely called death at all. It was completion. Medical explanations were not argued against in detail. They were dismissed as superficial. Germs, bacteria, and physical causes were described as surface-level phenomena, distractions from the true source of illness. To focus on them, members were told, was to misunderstand the nature of reality. Healing the body without addressing the spirit was seen as cosmetic at best, harmful at worst. The fear of medicine was reinforced subtly but relentlessly. Doctors were portrayed as well-meaning but misguided, trained to silence symptoms rather than interpret them. Hospitals were framed as places of panic, where fear interrupted the body's sacred work. Interventions were described as violent intrusions, forcing the body back into balance before it had completed its necessary transformation. Over time, this rhetoric made medical neglect feel responsible. Parents were taught that rushing to a doctor at the first sign of illness demonstrated a lack of trust, not just in the belief system, but in the child's spiritual capacity. Allowing the illness to unfold was framed as an act of faith. To interfere was to impose fear onto the child, to teach them that pain was something to escape rather than understand. The doctrine also provided an explanation for why some people suffered more than others. Those who remained healthy were not favored, they were simply untested. Those who endured prolonged illness were said to possess greater spiritual depth. This interpretation inverted social expectations and made suffering a form of status. It also insulated the belief from contradiction. If someone questioned why illness struck certain families repeatedly, the answer was always the same: they were chosen for deeper work. There was no room for randomness. The belief system also erased the concept of prevention. If illness was meaningful, then preventing it made no sense. Hygiene, diet, and caution were discussed only insofar as they supported mental clarity, not physical protection. Exposure to disease was not feared, it was neutral. If sickness followed, it was because it was meant to. This perspective had profound consequences. Conditions that required early intervention were allowed to progress. Fevers were monitored but untreated. Infections were observed rather than addressed. The body's deterioration was interpreted as confirmation that the process was underway. Members learned to watch themselves closely, but not in the way medicine encourages. They did not track symptoms to stop them, but to interpret them. Every ache carried significance. Every change was scrutinized for meaning. This constant inward focus intensified suffering, making it both physically and psychologically inescapable. The doctrine also created a moral trap. If illness was initiation, then failing to endure it faithfully was a kind of spiritual failure. Seeking relief became a confession of weakness. Those who secretly consulted doctors often did so in shame, hiding treatments and lying about improvements. When discovered, they were not punished outright, but they were pitted, gently corrected, and reminded of what they had interrupted. This atmosphere of quiet judgment kept most people compliant. Children, again, bore the heaviest burden. They were taught from a young age that their bodies were instruments of learning. Crying, they were told, only made the process harder. Complaints were discouraged. Obedience and calm endurance were praised. Over time, many learned to dissociate from their own pain, interpreting it through the language they had been given rather than their own instincts. The belief system was self-reinforcing. Every outcome supported it. Improvement meant the lesson was complete. Worsening meant the work was ongoing. Death meant the highest level had been reached. There was no scenario in which the doctrine could be challenged by reality. And that was its most dangerous feature. By redefining illness as enlightenment, the group removed all urgency from suffering. Pain no longer demanded response. Decline no longer signaled danger. The body, once a warning system, became a spiritual stage on which endurance was performed. In this world, the worst thing you could do was interfere. What made the doctrine so enduring was not its cruelty, but its coherence. It answered every question. It resolved every contradiction. And in doing so, it quietly transformed preventable suffering into something sacred, something that had to be protected rather than stopped. Once the belief that illness carried spiritual meaning was fully absorbed, it became woven into daily life through a series of quiet practices that govern how members ate, slept, worked, and responded to pain. There were no dramatic ceremonies announcing initiation. No single moment when someone was declared part of an inner circle. Instead, initiation unfolded slowly, through the body itself. Illness was both the doorway and the proof that one had crossed it. When a member fell sick, the response followed an unspoken script. The first step was withdrawal. The ill person was encouraged to rest away from outside influence, often in a quiet room within the home or a communal space shared by the group. This isolation was framed as protective, a way to shield the individual from fear, doubt, and what the group described as external interference. In reality, it removed access to anyone who might suggest medical help. During this period, the sick were closely observed. Their symptoms were discussed in low, careful tones, not with urgency, but with interpretation. A rising fever was not alarming, it was noted. Weakness was not treated, It was expected. The body's decline was tracked not to reverse it, but to understand what stage of initiation the person had reached. Food was often restricted. Fasting, or near fasting, was encouraged during illness under the belief that digestion distracted the body from its spiritual work. Hunger was framed as purification. Water was allowed, but even that could be limited during certain stages, especially if vomiting or diarrhea were present. These practices weakened already vulnerable bodies, but within the belief system, this weakening was seen as alignment. Prayer replaced diagnosis. Group members gathered quietly, sometimes around the sickbed, sometimes elsewhere, to reflect on what the illness represented. These were not emotional scenes. They were subdued, almost clinical. The goal was not to plead for recovery, but to remain receptive. Asking for healing was considered inappropriate unless the illness had completed its purpose. To ask too soon was to interfere. Silence played a powerful role. The sick were discouraged from speaking about their pain in emotional terms. Describing symptoms factually was acceptable. Expressing fear or distress was not. Such expressions were gently redirected, framed as resistance that could prolong the process. Over time, many learned to suppress not only complaints, but the instinct to seek comfort. This was especially true for children. When a child became ill, parents were expected to remain calm and composed. Panic, they were told, communicated distrust. Crying was discouraged, not through punishment, but through reframing. Children were told they were doing important work, that their bodies were learning something. That endurance made them strong. The language was soothing, even kind, but the effect was devastating. Pain was normalized. Intervention was delayed. Doctors were not explicitly forbidden in the early stages of the group's existence, but their involvement required justification. A member seeking medical help had to explain why the illness could not be allowed to unfold naturally. Often, this justification was never deemed sufficient. By the time symptoms worsened to the point where outside help was considered, it was often too late. The act of avoiding medicine became a form of loyalty. Members learned that their commitment was measured not by words, but by restraint. Could they resist the urge to intervene? Could they trust the process even as the body weakened? Those who could were quietly admired. Those who could not were comforted, but also subtly corrected. The message was clear. Faith meant patience, not action. Rituals emerged organically from these practices. Certain prayers were repeated during illness. Specific readings were shared. The sick were sometimes asked to reflect aloud on what they believed the illness was teaching them. These reflections were not optional. They reinforced the belief that suffering had purpose and that the individual bore responsibility for understanding it. If someone recovered, the group marked it not with celebration, but with solemn acknowledgement. The person was said to have completed a phase. They were expected to carry the insight forward, to be more disciplined, more receptive in the future. Recovery did not end scrutiny, it heightened it. Any subsequent illness was interpreted in light of previous lessons, increasing the pressure to endure even longer. If someone worsened, the response was equally controlled. Concern was expressed, but it was carefully managed. Fear was seen as contagious. Members were reminded that deterioration was not failure. It was depth. The closer someone came to death, the more sacred their experience was considered. This belief system erased the instinct to act. Instead of asking, "What can we do?" members asked, "What does this mean?" That shift transformed emergencies into contemplative events. Time slowed. Decisions were deferred. And in that delay, conditions that might have been treatable became irreversible. Secrecy was enforced without force. Members were discouraged from discussing illness with outsiders, who were described as incapable of understanding. Well-meaning neighbors were deflected. Relatives were reassured that everything was under control. Visits were limited. Information was filtered. This isolation protected the group from scrutiny and reinforced the sense that only those inside could be trusted. As illness became the primary pathway to deeper involvement, initiation never truly ended. Each new sickness was another test, another opportunity to demonstrate devotion. The body became a proving ground, constantly at risk, constantly observed. Over time, members learned to anticipate illness almost as a milestone. They watched for signs, interpreted sensations, prepared themselves mentally to endure. This anticipation did not make sickness easier, it made it inevitable. Stress, malnutrition, and untreated conditions compounded one another, creating a cycle in which illness became both cause and confirmation of belief. What makes these practices particularly chilling is their ordinariness. There were no chains, no locked doors, no overt cruelty. Everything was done in the language of care, of trust, of spiritual responsibility. And because of that, it rarely felt like abuse to those inside. It felt like devotion. By turning illness into initiation, the group ensured that suffering was never questioned, only interpreted. And in that interpretation, the line between faith and harm quietly disappeared. Once the belief system fully took hold, illness stopped being an interruption to daily life and became the central mechanism through which loyalty, faith, and belonging were measured. There was no formal announcement when someone crossed from ordinary membership into deeper commitment. Initiation was not marked by vows or ceremonies. It was marked by the body failing, and by how a person responded when it did. The moment someone reported feeling unwell, the group's behavior shifted. Not with alarm, but with attentiveness. The individual was encouraged to slow down, withdraw from outside obligations, and focus inward. Work, school, and social contact beyond the group were quietly set aside. This withdrawal was framed as care, but it also served another purpose. It cut off competing voices that might question what was about to happen. Illness was never treated as an emergency. Emergencies implied urgency, and urgency implied fear. Fear, members were taught, disrupted the spiritual process unfolding within the body. Instead, sickness was treated as a period of observation. The body was allowed to move where it needed to go, without interference. When symptoms appeared, they were discussed in measured, almost detached terms. A fever was not described as dangerous, but as active. Pain was not alarming, but revealing. Weakness was not deterioration, but softening. This language mattered. It reshaped perception, training members to see decline as progression. Medical help was not explicitly banned in most cases. That was part of the system's subtlety. Instead, members were taught to delay, to wait, to see what the illness would do if left alone. Doctors were portrayed as impulsive, trained to act rather than understand. True faith, the group insisted, required patience. That patience often proved fatal. During periods of illness, eating was restricted. Members believed digestion diverted energy away from spiritual work. Light meals or complete fasting were common, even for children. Hunger was framed as cleansing, a way of removing earthly distractions. Water intake varied, sometimes limited if vomiting or weakness occurred, under the belief that the body knew what it needed, or didn't. Sleep, too, was regulated. Excessive rest was discouraged, as it was believed to dull awareness. The sick were encouraged to remain conscious of their symptoms, to observe sensations rather than escape them. Pain was not something to be numbed or slept through. It was something to be experienced fully. Prayer sessions replaced treatment. These were not emotional appeals for recovery, but quiet gatherings centered on acceptance. Members reflected on what the illness might signify. They spoke about surrender, readiness, and trust. Asking for healing outright was subtly discouraged unless the group agreed the process had run its course. For children, this environment was especially brutal. When a child became ill, parents were expected to model calm detachment. Panic was considered harmful. Worry was said to transmit fear into the child's body. Crying was gently redirected, not punished, but reframed. Children were told they were brave, that they were learning something important, that their pain meant they were special. Over time, many children learned to suppress instinctive responses to suffering. They learned that asking for help meant disappointing the adults they trusted. They learned that endurance earned approval. Silence earned praise. Isolation was critical to maintaining control. Sick members were discouraged from seeing outsiders. Visits were limited. Questions from relatives were answered vaguely. If someone suggested medical help, they were described as well-meaning but misguided. Outsiders, members were told, could not understand what was happening because they were afraid of suffering. This framing transformed concern into threat. Inside the group, illness became a shared event. Other members watched closely, not out of morbid curiosity, but because someone else's suffering reinforced the belief system. Each prolonged illness served as proof that the doctrine was real, active, and demanding. Recovery without intervention was celebrated quietly as validation. Decline was treated with solemn respect. The longer someone remained ill, the more spiritually advanced they were considered. This created a perverse incentive. People learned, often unconsciously, that worsening symptoms brought attention and affirmation. To recover too quickly could feel like failure. To intervene could feel like cowardice. Some members did seek medical help in secret. They visited doctors quietly, hid medications, and lied about improvements. When these actions were discovered, the response was rarely anger. It was disappointment. A quiet sense that the person had interrupted something meaningful, that they had chosen comfort over understanding. This disappointment was powerful. It kept others compliant. Rituals developed organically around illness. Certain prayers were said at specific stages. Readings were repeated when fevers peaked or when weakness set in. The sick were sometimes asked to speak about what they believed the illness was teaching them. These reflections reinforced the idea that suffering was purposeful, and that failing to find meaning in it was a personal shortcoming. As illnesses progressed, the group's response remained consistent. There was no escalation, no last-minute intervention. Even when conditions clearly worsened, the emphasis remained on trust. Trust in the body. Trust in the process. Trust that whatever happened was necessary. When death occurred, it was not framed as loss in the conventional sense. Grief was allowed, but carefully contained. The death was described as completion. The individual had finished their work. The community spoke of it in hushed tones, with reverence rather than shock. This reframing prevented anger from taking hold. It prevented questions. Because if death was the ultimate initiation, then it could not be a failure. The most insidious aspect of these practices was how ordinary they felt to those inside. There were no dramatic displays of cruelty, no visible violence. Everything was done calmly, patiently, and with apparent compassion. That calm masked the urgency that was missing. It disguised neglect as faith. Over time, members internalized the rules so deeply that enforcement became unnecessary. They policed themselves. They delayed seeking help without being told. They reinterpreted pain automatically. They learned to mistrust their instincts. By turning illness into initiation, the group ensured that suffering was not something to escape, but something to endure, and in enduring it, members proved their loyalty not just to the belief system, but to the community that gave their pain meaning. The true cost of the belief system did not appear in sermons or teachings. It appeared in bodies. In the slow, quiet unraveling of lives that might have followed very different paths under other circumstances. The human stories inside the group were rarely dramatic in the way history often records tragedy. There were no public spectacles, no mass disappearances. Instead, there was a pattern of ordinary illnesses becoming extraordinary losses. One of the earliest cases discussed years later involved a young woman in her early 20s. She had arrived in California seeking health, drawn by the promise of a climate that was supposed to heal weak lungs and fragile constitutions. She suffered from recurring respiratory infections, nothing uncommon for the time, and often manageable with rest and basic medical care. When she joined the group, her coughing was reinterpreted as a sign of sensitivity. Her fatigue was framed as her body opening. At first, she improved. The sense of belonging, the calm explanations, and the removal of outside pressure seemed to ease her anxiety. But when the cough returned, it was no longer treated as a problem. She was encouraged to fast, to remain indoors, to avoid doctors who might interrupt the process. Over months, the cough deepened. Fever followed. Weight dropped. By the time anyone outside the group was notified, her condition had progressed into advanced tuberculosis. She died quietly, surrounded by people who believed she had completed something important. Her parents were told she had not been lost, but elevated. Children's stories were more difficult to reconstruct, in part because many survivors struggled to speak about them decades later. One family lost 2 children within a span of 3 years, both from illnesses that began with ordinary symptoms. The first developed a persistent fever and sore throat. The second suffered from gastrointestinal distress that never fully resolved. In both cases, medical care was delayed until the conditions worsened beyond reversal. Neighbors noticed the absences. The children stopped attending school. Excuses were offered: rest, spiritual focus, sensitivity. When death occurred, it was explained as destiny. There were no funerals in the traditional sense. Grief was private, subdued, and carefully framed. Public mourning, members were told, could interfere with the completion of the process. Survivors often carried a different kind of burden. Some lived, but not without consequences. Untreated infections led to chronic damage. Poor nutrition during illness stunted growth. Repeated fasting weakened immune systems already under strain. Many who left the group later described bodies that never fully recovered, even after they began seeking conventional medical care. One former member recalled losing partial vision after a severe infection was left untreated for weeks. Another described permanent joint damage from rheumatic fever that was interpreted as spiritual resistance rather than a medical emergency. These individuals survived, but they did so with a lingering sense of guilt, wondering whether their suffering had been enough, whether seeking help later had undone something meaningful. Adults, too, were not spared. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Women were encouraged to endure labor without medical assistance unless absolutely necessary. Pain was framed as purposeful, a rite of passage that should not be interfered with. Complications were often recognized too late. Infections after delivery were treated as spiritual trials. Several women survived only after emergency interventions forced by circumstances beyond the group's control. Others did not. Those who died in childbirth were spoken of with reverence. Their suffering was described as a final offering. Their deaths reinforced the belief that the doctrine demanded everything, and that giving everything was noble. Men in the group faced a different kind of pressure. Physical endurance was tied to moral strength. Admitting weakness was difficult. Injuries from work were ignored. Infections from cuts went untreated. One man continued laboring despite severe abdominal pain that turned out to be appendicitis. By the time he collapsed, his condition was beyond saving. What united these stories was not recklessness, but consistency. In each case, the same steps were followed. Symptoms were interpreted, not treated. Outside help was delayed, not denied outright. Hope was redirected away from recovery and toward meaning. And by the time the danger was undeniable, intervention was either too late or framed as unnecessary. The emotional toll on families was immense, though rarely acknowledged openly. Parents buried children while being told it was a privilege. Spouses watched partners decline while being reminded to trust. Grief had to be carefully managed to avoid becoming doubt. Tears were allowed, but anger was not. Questions were softened into reflection. Years later, survivors described a strange dissonance. At the time, everything felt calm, even purposeful. Only in hindsight did the horror become clear. Many spoke of waking up years later with the realization that what they had called faith had been neglect, that what they had accepted as destiny had been preventable. Leaving the group was not easy. Those who did often faced social isolation, guilt, and fear that they had betrayed something sacred. Some delayed seeking medical care even after leaving, their instincts permanently altered. Others struggled with anger, toward the founder, toward the group, toward themselves. What is perhaps most disturbing is how quietly these losses accumulated. There was no single moment of catastrophe, no event dramatic enough to force immediate intervention. Each case, taken alone, could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern of suffering that only became visible when it was too late. These were not people who wanted to die. They were people who trusted. They trusted that pain had purpose, that endurance was virtue, that intervention was interference. And in that trust, they surrendered not just their bodies, but their ability to recognize danger when it appeared. The human cost of the belief system cannot be measured only in deaths. It must also be measured in lives permanently altered, in childhoods shaped by silence, in instincts trained to ignore warning signs. Long after the group itself faded, its teachings continued to echo in the bodies and minds of those who survived. And for many, the most painful realization came later, when they understood that the suffering they had endured was not inevitable. It had simply been given meaning, at the expense of their lives. By the time the consequences of the group's beliefs became visible, the damage had already followed a familiar and tragic pattern, one that medicine, even in the early 20th century, understood all too well. The illnesses that devastated members were not mysterious or unknown conditions. They were common, recognizable, and in many cases treatable, even with the limited medical tools available at the time. What made them deadly was not their nature, but the refusal to respond to them as medical emergencies. In the 1920s, American medicine was far from perfect, but it was not powerless. Doctors understood infection. They recognized the dangers of prolonged fever, dehydration, and malnutrition. Tuberculosis was widespread but not incomprehensible. Pneumonia, while often fatal, was known to worsen rapidly without intervention. Appendicitis, childbirth complications, and wound infections followed predictable courses if ignored. What the group rejected was not miraculous cures, it was basic care. When a fever persisted beyond a few days, physicians of the time knew it signaled serious infection. Without antibiotics, treatment focused on rest, hydration, isolation, and symptom management. These measures did not guarantee survival, but they significantly improved outcomes. In the group, however, fever was interpreted as activation. Hydration was limited. Rest was controlled. Isolation served ideology rather than protection. Dehydration alone likely caused or accelerated many deaths. Vomiting and diarrhea, common in childhood illnesses, rapidly drained the body of fluids. Modern readers may underestimate how quickly this becomes fatal without intervention. Even then, doctors understood the importance of fluid replacement. The group did not. Thirst was seen as part of purification. Weakness was reframed as surrender. The body's alarms were silenced by belief. Malnutrition compounded the problem. Fasting during illness weakened immune responses already under strain. Children and pregnant women were especially vulnerable. The body requires energy to fight infection. By denying it nourishment, members unintentionally hastened decline. What the group called spiritual cleansing was, in biological terms, starvation. Respiratory illnesses were among the most devastating. Tuberculosis, which claimed many lives in the early 20th century, progressed slowly. Early treatment, rest, nutrition, fresh air, and isolation could dramatically extend life and sometimes lead to recovery. In the group, persistent coughs were spiritualized. Weight loss was interpreted as shedding attachment. By the time the disease was undeniable, lungs were often irreparably damaged. Infections from minor injuries followed a similar trajectory. A cut or scrape could become infected, spreading bacteria through the bloodstream. Doctors knew this. Antiseptics were available. Basic wound care saved lives. Yet members were encouraged to let such injuries resolve themselves. When sepsis developed, it was too late. Childbirth reveals the starkest contrast between belief and biology. By the 1920s, trained midwives and physicians understood the risks of prolonged labor, hemorrhage, and postpartum infection. Interventions were imperfect, but they existed. Within the group, pain was valorized. Complications were reframed as trials. Infections that could have been treated early became fatal within days. The group's interpretation of illness did more than delay care. It actively distorted perception. Members were taught to distrust their instincts. Fear, they were told, created illness rather than responded to it. Pain was not a signal to act, but a sign to wait. This reversal of cause and effect removed the body's ability to communicate danger. From a medical perspective, this was catastrophic. The human body relies on feedback loops. Pain prompts protection. Fever prompts rest and care. Weakness prompts intervention. By overriding these responses with spiritual interpretation, the group severed the connection between symptom and survival. Even when members sought medical help, it was often too late. Doctors encountered patients in advanced stages of disease, emaciated, dehydrated, septic. In some cases, physicians reportedly recognized patterns of neglect, but lacked authority to intervene without consent. Religious justification complicated matters. By the time legal involvement was considered, outcomes were irreversible. What makes this particularly haunting is how preventable much of it was. Modern medicine did not need to exist to save these lives. Basic care, timely intervention, and respect for the body's warnings would have altered countless outcomes. The belief system did not just fail to heal, it ensured harm by rejecting the very mechanisms that promote survival. The psychological impact of this rejection cannot be overstated. Members learned to dissociate from their bodies. Sensations became abstract. Pain lost urgency. This dissociation persisted even after individuals left the group. Survivors often delayed seeking care for years, their internal alarm systems permanently muted. From a scientific standpoint, the group's beliefs represent a complete inversion of how health functions. Illness is not a test of worth. It is not selective based on readiness. It is not purposeful. It is biological. Random. Influenced by environment, genetics, and exposure. To impose moral meaning onto it is to misunderstand its nature, and to risk fatal consequences. Yet the group's beliefs thrived because they offered emotional certainty. Medicine offered probabilities. Faith offered explanations. In moments of crisis, explanation can feel more comforting than uncertainty. But comfort does not equal safety. The tragedy lies not in the rejection of science alone, but in the replacement of response with reverence. By treating illness as initiation, the group removed all urgency from suffering. And without urgency, there is no intervention. In the end, the body always followed its own rules. Infections spread. Organs failed. Dehydration killed. These processes did not pause for belief. They did not recognize meaning. They proceeded relentlessly, indifferent to interpretation. The group believed they had transcended biology. What they had actually done was ignore it. And biology, unlike belief, does not forgive. For years, what happened inside the group remained largely invisible to the outside world. There were no public declarations of defiance, no open rejection of law or authority. From the outside, the community appeared quiet, private, and deeply spiritual. That invisibility was not accidental. It was maintained through careful silence and the belief that outsiders simply could not understand what was taking place. But patterns have a way of surfacing. Neighbors began to notice things that did not sit easily. Children who stopped attending school for long stretches of time. Adults who appeared increasingly frail, withdrawn, or chronically ill. Ambulances were rarely seen, even when illness was obvious. When questions were asked, answers were vague but calm. Everything was under control. Everything was being handled. Teachers were often the first to grow uneasy. School absences piled up. Notes from parents spoke of rest and spiritual focus rather than diagnosis. Some children returned thinner, weaker, more subdued. Others did not return at all. Administrators raised concerns, but lacked concrete evidence. In an era that strongly protected parental and religious authority, suspicion alone was rarely enough. Doctors, too, encountered fragments of the story. Patients arrived late in the course of illness, sometimes escorted by anxious relatives who had finally insisted on intervention. The severity of these cases raised questions. Why had treatment been delayed so long? Why were basic symptoms ignored? Some physicians suspected neglect, but proving it was difficult. Religious explanation provided a shield that few wanted to challenge directly. Inside the group, doubt began to flicker. Not everyone could watch repeated suffering without questioning it. Some members quietly wondered why illness seemed to cluster within certain families. Others struggled when children died despite faithful endurance. These doubts were rarely spoken aloud. When they were met with gentle redirection. Doubt, members were told, was fear disguised as thought. To entertain it was to risk interrupting the process. A few individuals did leave. Some did so quietly, without confrontation. Others tried to warn relatives or authorities, only to find themselves dismissed as bitter or unstable. Their story sounded unbelievable to those who had not witnessed the slow, quiet damage firsthand. The turning point did not come from one dramatic event, but from accumulation. Too many deaths. Too many sick children. Too many late-stage medical emergencies arriving at hospitals. Eventually, whispers connected. Patterns emerged. What had once looked like coincidence began to resemble neglect. By then, however, the damage was deeply embedded. The group's beliefs had been practiced for years without serious interference. And when outside attention finally sharpened into scrutiny, it revealed not a single crime, but a system, one built on conviction, silence, and the dangerous sanctification of suffering. The moment when the group could no longer remain hidden did not arrive with chaos or violence. It arrived quietly, through paperwork, whispered testimony, and the slow weight of accumulated evidence. A death that could no longer be explained away. A child whose condition forced a teacher or doctor to act. A case that crossed the line from private belief into public concern. When authorities finally began to look closely, what they encountered was not an overtly criminal organization, but something more difficult to confront. The group insisted they had broken no laws. They had not physically restrained anyone. They had not openly forbidden medical care. They had simply trusted a higher understanding. And in the legal language of the time, that distinction mattered. Investigations moved cautiously. Religious freedom loomed large, and officials were wary of overreach. Interviews were conducted. Homes were visited. Records were reviewed. What emerged was a pattern of delayed care, repeated fasting during illness, and a consistent refusal to involve medical professionals until conditions were irreversible. None of these actions, taken alone, were necessarily illegal. Together, they painted a troubling picture. When cases reached the courts, the focus was narrow. Individual deaths were examined rather than the belief system as a whole. Prosecutors struggled to prove intent. Parents insisted they had acted in love. The group's leader spoke calmly, framing every decision as faith rather than neglect. Without clear evidence of coercion, accountability was limited. Public attention followed briefly. Newspapers reported on unusual deaths and controversial beliefs, often framing the story as a clash between faith and medicine rather than systemic harm. Sensational headlines faded quickly. The group did not collapse overnight. Instead, it fractured. Some members drifted away quietly, shaken by scrutiny. Others doubled down, interpreting investigation as persecution. The leader retreated from public view, reducing gatherings and avoiding attention. Teachings continued, but more cautiously, more privately. What ultimately dismantled the group was not a single verdict, but exposure. The belief system could not survive sustained daylight. Families moved away. Meetings stopped. The network dissolved into isolated individuals carrying the same ideas without the same structure. The collapse was anticlimactic, almost invisible. There were no arrests that satisfied public outrage. No sweeping reforms. Just silence where certainty had once lived. And within that silence, survivors were left to reckon with what had been lost, without closure, without justice, and with the unsettling knowledge that belief alone had been enough to destroy lives.